This is not just terrible for Israelis and for the Jewish community. This is terrible for Americans. Let me start with the first thing that, to me, is the most violent and the most vile, which is his whitewashing of what Intifada is about. So he keeps saying that globalized Intifada means something else for different people. That is not true. I have lived through 2 Intifadas. I know exactly what they mean. An Intifada means a violent uprising against the Jews.
Yes. Intifada means a violent uprising against the Jews. That word intifada just means violence against Jews. There's nothing else that it could possibly mean. Forget the military occupation and subsequent siege and blockade of Gaza and these people crying out saying, yeah, exactly, cry harder. That's what I said. I said, did you try crying about it? There it is. See? We're going to ratio this. I'm here for the ratio, okay? But you know what's funny is that she says that globalize the Intifada just means it's calling for worldwide violence against the Jews. Well, I actually retweeted this because when I say when you want to incriminate Israel, just quote their own officials, right? Because she says one thing, well, that's not true according to the Israeli government. They never looked at Intifada as meaning a violence, unremittent violence against the Jews. According to Israel's own foreign minister, Shlomo Ben Ami, an Intifada is an authentic struggle for Palestinian self-determination, end quote. He lived through 2 of them, and he also was crucial in the implementation of the Oslo Accords and the subsequent Camp David meetup. So you had the first Intifada, which happened in 1987, and that eventually led to the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Agreement was another farce. It was another way of getting Israel to hire Palestinian subcontractors to basically do the duties of military occupation without an occupation actually being present. Both of these times, by the way, the only reason it became violent was at the escalation of the IDF, both Intifadas. By all accounts, even by the Israeli government itself, the first Intifada and the second Intifada began peacefully. These were peaceful gatherings of protest. What were they protesting? They were protesting the violence. They were protesting the only aggressive violence in that place, which was committed by the IDF. And they were, because, as we know, the IDF is capable of the worst shit, and they have been time and time again. I mean, they're constantly provoking, constantly raiding into the Gaza Strip, constantly targeting civilians. I believe that the first Intifada happened because of a traffic stop. This was what set it off completely, was a traffic stop. This is in 1987. They're still considered legally a military occupation that is operating within the occupied territories, which is different from what the legal terms of occupation were in 2005. Okay, so just to make that clear. But the IDF was patrolling, and they pulled over this car, and I forget whatever reason, but of course they end up shooting them, and people are killed. I forget the exact numbers, but that's what sort of set off this catalyst that became the first Intifada. And the same can be said for the second Intifada, which was also due to what Henry Kissinger has called freezing the conflict, and as a number of U.S. diplomats have called this, is prefer a frozen conflict, which just means that Israel's continued its occupation. Nothing changes, really, but everything that they've done up to that point has been normalized. The Palestinians grow frustrated. They look at the PLO, they look at the PA as corrupt, the Fatah movement under Yasser Arafat. They start to see these VIPs in the Gaza Strip as really traitors to Palestine because they are being paid off by the Israelis. And that's exactly what's happened. That was outlined in the Oslo Accords themselves, the first one, and subsequently in the Camp David meetup, which happened after the first Oslo Accords ultimately failed to produce peace because the second Intifada happened. Even the Oslo Accords themselves in 94, when Bill Clinton was president, it's a whole story there that at every turn vindicates the Palestinians and at every turn incriminates the Israelis. And remember, under the laws of belligerent occupation from the Universal Humanitarian Law Book that is administered by the International Committee for the Red Cross, they must negotiate in good faith. That's for every belligerent occupation, you know. In times of war, there's a set of rules that are to be adhered to by what they consider legally a belligerent occupier, and that's what Israel is and has been, of course. But one of the things is, like, it's a war crime, actually, to not negotiate in good faith. If you study the Oslo Accords, you can see that that is exactly what's happened. But Shlomo Ben Ami counters what Noah Tishby is claiming, that, you know, an intifada is just, it just means violence against the Jews, because he understood that it was an authentic struggle for Palestinian self-determination. Everything that you would ever need to know about the Gaza Strip and every point that the Zionists try to conjure up in their Hasbara campaign has been answered and rebuked and debunked by Norman Finkelstein in his book, The Gaza Strip. It got me thinking, okay, here it is. In fact, you know how we're just talking about the first intifada? Right here. Listen to this. In December of 1987, a traffic accident on the Gaza-Israel border that left 4 Palestinians dead. This is exactly the traffic stop I was just referring to that triggered the first intifada. So I was not lying to you, okay? That left 4 Palestinians dead triggered a mass rebellion, or intifada, against Israeli rule throughout the occupied territories. I mean, it's like saying the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was just violence against the Germans. They hate us because we're German. That's exactly what it is. And the people like this, it's like, don't just stop there. Take your logic and apply it to, if you want to be principled about it, you want to be consistent about it, then apply it to all other historical precedents. Apply it to all other historical analogs, where you had the dynamic of colonized and colonizer, occupied and occupier, oppressed and oppressor. So the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 rose up and revolted against their slave owners. The slaves that revolted against their slave owners, they were also just violence against the whites, I guess. Like, just because they're white. Classic Zionist move to just make it about ideology. Don't look here to the actual physical material reality of what we're doing, what the functional role we are serving in this society is. Forget all that. Think about this other over here about, I don't know, King David or something. Like, anything to draw you away from what we're actually doing. That's so evident when they just want to make it about Jews. It's all about the... Well, we don't fall for that over here. You hear? Benny Morris, remember that sellout? He actually wrote a book detailing all of this, apparently, and it was... Actually, he saw it soberly, even though he is an Israeli historian. An Israeli historian. What does that mean? A fairy tale writer? A fan fiction novelist? Is that what that means? Israeli historian? As despicable as Benny Morris is, he even admitted that it was not an armed rebellion, but a massive, persistent campaign of civil resistance, with strikes and commercial shutdowns, accompanied by violent, though unarmed, demonstrations against the occupying forces, which, under international law, as a side note, is their obligation and their duty and their right. He continues, the stone and occasionally the Molotov cocktail and knife were its symbols and weapons, not guns and not bombs. Cannot be said, however, that Israel reacted in kind, says Finkelstein now. Morris continued, quote, almost everything was tried. Shooting to kill, shooting to injure, beatings, mass arrests, torture, trials, administrative detention, and economic sanctions. This is all the tactics that Benny Morris is recounting that were Israel's actions. A large proportion of the Palestinian dead were not shot in life-threatening situations, and a great many of these were children. That's another Benny Morris quote for the first intifada, talking about the IDF escalation. Only a small minority of IDF malefactors were brought to book by the army's legal machinery. Well, no shit. And were almost always let off with ludicrously light sentences. This is Benny Morris, once again, liberal Zionist. Finkelstein continues, by the early 1990s, Israel had successfully repressed the first intifada. It subsequently entered into an agreement secretly negotiated in Oslo, Norway, with the Palestine Liberation Organization and ratified in September of 93 on the White House lawn. There's a big story that he's glossing over there, but he gets into it later. But yeah, that he's talking about the Oslo Accords. Israel intended via the Oslo Accord to streamline the occupation. There's a good word. There's a good way of thinking about it. You can think of the Oslo Accords as a way for Israel to streamline the occupation by removing its troops from direct contact with Palestinians and supplanting them with Palestinian subcontractors. Ooh, ah, One of the meanings of Oslo, says former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben Ami, was that the PLO was Israel's collaborator in the task of stifling the Intifada and cutting short what was, get this, an authentically democratic struggle for Palestinian independence. Boom. Noah Tishby down for the count. You know what I mean? Like, this is a quote from an Israeli official themselves who was directly involved in the first and second Intifada, in the upper levels of the Israeli administration. And he was there first. That's a primary source, not some TikTok content creator who's paid off by the Zionists. So why is he not agreeing with Noah Tishby? Are we going to go ahead and then follow her logic and say that Shlomo Ben Ami, the Israeli foreign minister, is an anti-Semite? Is he a self-hating hater, anti-Semitic prick? Or is Noah Tishby maybe full of... I will leave it to you to ponder the conclusions.